Hello and welcome to Your Ghana, My Ghana. I'm Ruby Ofori, and today we're asking, should Vice President Mahamudu Bawumia and former President John Dramani Mahama call a truce to hold a summit aimed at re-engineering our governance system? My guests are Dr. Yao Graham, coordinator of Third World Network Africa, one of the continent's foremost campaign and policy organizations on economic justice and the environment. We also have Dr. Anthony Yao Ba, the Secretary General of the Trades Union Congress of Ghana. But before we begin our discussion, let's have an outline of the challenges facing our two-party governance system.
Ghana is facing a political and economic crisis as the nation heads to the polls this December. It's becoming increasingly clear that successive governments have failed to implement promises of economic transformation outlined in their party manifestos. Currently, the nation faces one of the worst economic crises in a generation. To get a taste of what that means, let's take a look at a slice of life in the bustling town of Santor, just northeast of the capital city, Accra. Here, a familiar scene unfolds daily as impoverished passengers enter a dilapidated, rusty trotro bus, a poignant symbol of Accra's struggling public transport system. For the weary residents of Santor, life is a constant battle against soaring prices of basic utilities and food, lack of pipe-borne water, intermittent power outages, and most galling of all, the neglect of the main road, the Ajay Kojo Road that connects them to essential hubs like Tema Port and Medina Market. The road is barely passable, though successive governments have promised but failed to pave it. Despite their hardships, Santor's residents are gearing up to make their voices heard in the upcoming elections. However, the town's political landscape is deeply entrenched in ethnic voting patterns, leaving it sidelined in development projects. Studies suggest communities like those in Santor that are hardcore supporters of either of these parties, the National Democratic Congress and the new Patriotic Party, get no benefits in terms of development from either of the two parties because their support is taken for granted. As Ghana faces these challenges, the upcoming elections present an opportunity for change. Leaders like Vice President Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia and former President John Dramani Mahama possess the experience and influence to address systemic issues. A truce between these political heavyweights could pave the way for much-needed reforms, reducing the concentration of power in the presidency and empowering local governance structures. In this pivotal moment, the onus falls on these leaders to set aside their differences and work together for the greater good. Through collaboration and decisive action, they can steer Ghana towards a brighter future where governance serves the people and fosters inclusive development.
So we can begin the actual discussion, which is the best part. Thank you both for joining me. Dr. Graham and Dr. Yao Ba. My first question for both of you is, we've had 30 years of party political rule, with each administration taking office on the wave of popular support, with a manifesto that promises transformational change. In 2016, the ruling New Patriotic Party promised Ghanaians a Ghana beyond aid and agricultural transformation in the slogan Planting for Food and Jobs, as well as industrial growth in the slogan One District, One Factory. In that same election in 2016, the National Democratic Congress gave us Changing Lives, Transforming Ghana, our vision for Ghana, a peaceful, secure, and prosperous nation providing sustainable jobs through the industrialization for transformation. But once in office, in the case of both parties, we see very little in the way of transformational change. What prevents these two political parties, and possibly any party, from achieving their manifesto promises? Let's start with Dr. Graham.
Yeah, thanks, and greetings to your viewers. First of all, I think if you look at the manifestos of the two parties, both contain a recognition of some of the key challenges facing our country, some of the key challenges actually facing African countries in general. The whole question of agrarian transition, the issue of employment, the issue of industrialization, fundamentally the issue of structural transformation. So in terms of the identification of the issues, I think by and large, the parties have not been wrong. But of course, it's in how you understand the issue, which also then leads to the kinds of solutions that you offer. The other issue, of course, is that the parties, it's one thing making promises, it's another thing being capable of delivering them. And I think the question of capacity is not simply whether you have the analytical capacity, but also the social, the character of the parties, who dominates the parties, and also ultimately, therefore, the sense of accountability between the parties and the electorate. I think it is fair to say that if you follow what has happened in the electoral cycle over the years, from 1992 to now, we have seen a growing disconnect between what the parties promise, disconnect between the electorate and the parties in power. The two main political parties basically have become parties that see their accountability primarily to their membership, as opposed to the electorate that put them in power. I mean, you see it all over, the anxiety about foot soldiers and their influence, who gets jobs, the absence of competency criteria for appointments, which has led to the destruction of the public service being packed with loyalists who are not qualified. How public resources are spent, even on seeming development projects, being tainted by issues of patronage and corruption and so on. So I think it's important to recognize these things. And of course, these are also linked to which social classes dominate the parties. Political parties in Ghana, in spite of their periodic selection of candidates and so on, they are not democratic organizations. Because if they're democratic organizations that were accountable to the several hundred thousands that each one of them claims to have as members, that accountability to the membership would also be reflected in a greater sensitivity to the interests of the diverse social groups, social strata who actually are the membership. The parties are dominated by small cliques of people who control resources, who treat the rest of the membership as beneficiaries, of their patronage. And of course, this is also connected with the cultures of power in society and the hierarchies that people accept and work with. So I think that's an important internal factor. But there's also the larger international context within which a transformation agenda has to unfold, and a readiness to take risk and deal with challenges. Because to carry out the transformations that they promise, there are already vested interests, domestic and international, in the Ghanaian economic and political model. To make the changes promised require being ready to challenge and overcome the resistance of those forces and build coalitions for change. And the coalitions for change which are required in this country really are not the people who dominate the political parties, who see themselves as beneficiaries of government contracts without credibility or competence, who see themselves as having protection in terms of the goods that they can import and sell, which is detrimental to any project of industrialization and so on and so forth. So this is an important issue. Vested interests who are not committed to the kind of change that will be needed if the manifestos of the governments actually are dominant in the parties. So what is put out is for the public to consume. And of course, that is put out also in a context where the electorate don't simply vote for what is being promised. A large part of the electorate all the time are voting to get rid of the sitting government because they are fed up with it. So the manifestos are just part of the drivers of the choices that the electorate make.
Dr. Ba, would you agree with what Dr. Yao Graham has said about the internal and external factors preventing political parties from actually implementing transformational change?
Thank you, Ruby, for having me. I listened to Dr. Graham very, very carefully, and I would like to first associate myself with all what he has said. I'll just add a few points. Some of them just to emphasize the points that Dr. Graham has already made. First, let's start with peace. Relatively speaking, both parties, we have kept peace for over 3 decades, and I think we should acknowledge that. The economy is not everything. So Ghana has not done badly when it comes to keeping peace for ourselves. So let me make that point first before I move on to the main question. First, about manifestos. What is the purpose of manifestos? Why do the political parties come up with manifestos? The idea is to get as many votes as possible. And for some reason, like Dr. Graham has just said, the political parties are election machineries. They are election machines. They have a way of getting the votes, whether people have even looked at their manifestos or not. So the manifesto, yes, but I have my doubts whether the electorate even pay attention to manifestos before they go to vote for the political parties. If the electorate is paying attention, then of course, the manifestos will be designed to get their votes. So assuming people pay attention, then they are voting because they think the political parties will come and then implement what they have put in their manifestos. I doubt that. Now, when they take over the government and they are ruling or they are in charge, then there is this problem. And I have observed that political parties first seek their survival. So when they are in power and they try to strike the balance between what they promised to do for the country and what they should do so that their party will survive and win the next election, that conflict now arises. And when that conflict arises, the interest of the party supersedes the interest of the nation. So some governments have shown that they really wanted to do something, but there is resistance from their own political party, and that is what Dr. Graham called the internal forces. They now are unable to do what is right for the country. So for as long as we continue with party politics, we will have a situation where the interest of the parties to survive will always supersede the interest of the nation. And that may be one of the big reasons why the nice things they put in their manifesto they are unable to implement. And the other thing Dr. Graham put in another way has to do with trying to harness all the resources in the country to bring change. When the political parties take over, what we have all observed is that if you are not linked to the political party, you are not likely to be placed in a position to manage the resources of the country. But we have a situation where you may have even a whole chunk of people who can manage better outside the political party. So in order to actually achieve change or transformational change, we need to have a system where whether people are linked to a political party or not, provided they have the capacity to manage, the political party will allow those people to manage. Then you would have to deal with the other problem where people tag people. Because you have been appointed a board member, it means you are linked to a political party. And many people who really want to do their things don't want to be tagged because of the consequences of that. So this is what I wanted to add to Dr. Graham's points made earlier.
Thank you, Dr. Ba. I think you both agree that the problem is kind of quite complex and internal, external. It also has to do with the economy that we find ourselves in. But if you both agree that, and what I'm hearing from both of you is that to some extent the parties cannot self-regulate, cannot transform themselves, then what is there to do? How can the system, how can it be reformed? Who should reform it? Should it be the trade unions? Should it be another military intervention? God forbid, something nobody wants to see ever again. What realistically do you think can happen to reform these parties, and from where?
Well, I mean, the reform of the parties, the character of the parties is actually not the starting point of the. I think the problem of the parties is a function of a number of variables, many of which are outside the parties. First of all, I mean, the culture of around power in this society is an issue. The instinct for popular organization and accountability and democratic organization, it's challenged, it's problematic by and large, because the dominant power relations in our society are hierarchical in a variety of ways. And traditional leadership, which is very pervasive, actually you find that the internal cultures of political parties, which are nominally democratic organizations, in many ways replicate the hierarchies of traditional leadership. I mean, this is an important issue with all its manifestations about age hierarchies, gender hierarchies, even ethnic hierarchies, okay, within the parties. So I think this culture of power that I'm talking about, it's a major issue. So you may have regulations about fundraising and all kinds of things, but the internal cultures of the parties themselves, within the party as well as to society at large, it's a problem. So the problem of the parties is part of a bigger challenge that we face. Now, I think that the problem of the parties would be solved partly through whatever regulatory changes may be needed to improve their accountability to their membership and to society at large. But more fundamentally also through the growth and transformation of the political culture of the country. Because a lot of people are not looking forward to the coming elections with excitement. If the NDC wins the election, it will be because people want to get rid of the NPP, not because they have great expectations of the NDC. Okay, so we have a situation where really we are faced with a kind of Hobson's choice. You really don't like what you got, but when you look at the alternative, you say, you know what, let's get rid of this lot. Because we had an unprecedented level of corruption and mismanagement. At least let's get them out of here. Because if we don't, things will collapse. So when we get to a point where the electorate is dissatisfied, you also are at the point, you are at an inflection point where society is going to begin to express itself either by not turning up to vote, or there are going to be challenges to the parties themselves internally, because in the parties there's a lot of discontent also about how candidates get selected and so on and so forth. But critically, I think the murmurings about the need for new parties to emerge is likely also to be a factor. So the dynamics of correction in the political thing is also part of the process of the maturation, of electoral politics. Part of that correction also will come from other political forces beginning to put issues on the agenda and showing that things can be done differently, so that there's a challenging culture, so that the cozy, alternation between two really bankrupt parties comes to be challenged by the reaction of the electorate. Because in different ways, the NDC and the NPP are bankrupt in terms of their attitude to the population and also people's experience of them as ruling parties. I mean, they are the dominant parties, but we know they are smaller parties. And hopefully with time, this correction will take place. And it will also get to an inflection point where some party would have to begin to show that they care about what the electorate thinks. So the transformation thing is not a simple thing, because these parties are creatures of our political culture. They didn't drop on the sky, okay? And that process of transformation itself is part of the transformation of the political culture. A political culture where colonialism left authoritarian, ways of doing things, traditional rule left authoritarian ways, or hierarchical ways of doing things, and years of military government created cultures of impunity. I mean, look at the soldiers and policemen who are driving against traffic and flashing their lights because they feel they can. Okay, I mean, little things like that. These are all part of the fabric of the challenge that needs to be changed.
We interviewed Samia Nkrumah a couple of weeks ago, and we asked her what had happened to the CPP for it to seemingly not even be able to field MPs or win parliamentary seats. And she mentioned that the bigger parties interfere with the smaller parties. So and that's what we're seeing, is that, they've taken up the entire space. So in hope of, a resurgence of accountability or opposition to the big parties, it doesn't look like it's going to come very soon. Dr. Ba, what's your take on the possibility for change? And from where would it come? Would it come from the unions?
Yeah, we hope so. I think it's possible for the political parties to change. And as Doc said, if they don't change, they will die. They will die because people, after the inflection, will now start looking, because it's 30 years since these two parties have been ruling or misruling this country. And I agree with Dr. Graham when he says that they are both bankrupt. What is frustrating them is the political culture, the colonialism he mentioned, the ethnic politics that we have been playing, and traditions and so on. But this will not last for long. because civil society organizations are not going to sleep forever. As I speak to you, African Center for Economic Transformation is leading an initiative, and the TUC is part of it. A number of very powerful civil society organizations are part of it. We are working on what we call the social contract. Now we expect that the political parties will adopt and adapt this social contract into their policies. They are both bankrupt because they don't seem to know exactly what policies they should implement for us to transform this country. And the civil society organizations, once under asset, under this initiative which is going, and I'm sure many more will come, they will open the minds and the eyes of the public to the bankruptcy of these two political parties. And therefore, the political party that will survive will be the one who will align itself to the social contract that we are developing. And also the one who will listen to the civil society and the civil society groupings, including labor. This is the first time TUC has come up with Workers' Manifesto. We have been here for 32 years now. It means gradually you see other civil society organizations, including traditional leaders, coming with their demands. And the political party that will survive will be the one that will align itself with the aspirations of these civil society organizations. Now, the point that was made by Dr. Graham was that perhaps these two parties may not be able to reform, and if that happens, there will be other parties that will emerge. And if indeed they are the ones that will align themselves to the aspirations of the people, these two parties, just like CPP has faded out completely, will also fade out. And that is why it's a big challenge for them. Now, I always ask myself, NDC and MPP, what is the difference between these two parties? Really? NDC says they are social democratic. MPP, they say they are center-right. But in terms of policy, they are both bankrupt. Therefore, the chance is that if they don't work very hard to transform themselves towards the aspirations of the people of Ghana, there will be another party. Hiring some soldiers to continue the misrule is the answer. I think we should work together as civil society organizations and make sure that everybody in this country knows that this country is for us, and it's not for these two political parties.
I get the sense that the parties, though, are like organs in a body. If you get rid of them, you may harm yourself in terms of overall health. And at the same time, we're seeing in Nigeria, the Nigerian Labour Congress was pivotal in forming the Labour Party there and bringing a third force into their political arena. You, Dr. Ba, you described a new movement. You just mentioned a new movement that is coming up in Ghana. Can you be clear? Is it trying to form a third party, a third force, or just come up with a framework that various organizations can support?
Yeah, the idea of the African Center for Economic Transformation initiative is not to create a third force. The idea is to develop what we call a social contract, and that will have spelled out all what, because we are doing a lot of consultations, so views from everybody, or I hope everybody, from all big groups, all important groups, will reflect in this social contract. And what we expect is that either these two political parties or a third force or a fourth force or a fifth force will come in and say, hey, this is what the people want, and this is the future they want, and let us do things so we can meet their demands. And what I was saying was not that we are creating a political party, a third one. No. We expect political parties that are in existence today and those that will emerge over time to buy into this social contract, which in our view represents the interests of everybody, not the political parties. The trade unions have stayed away from forming a political party in Ghana because of the experiences the unions had in the 60s. But I cannot completely rule it out that trade unions will never go into party politics in Ghana. The way things are going, and from the discussions that we have held in our general council meetings, and how some leaders have come out boldly to say we have to change our constitution and either create a political party or support a political party that we think will develop this country. This situation will not last for long, where the trade unions remain neutral in terms of political party formations. It may end very soon. And if that happens, then it will be very interesting, because in that case, we expect workers to build a party that will respond to their demands and the demands of their families.
Dr. Graham, is it possible for the trade unions to provide the impetus for a third force, to power a third force, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think if we are talking about possibility in that general sense, of course, but we should also look at the concrete situation and the reality of each country's political culture. I think that in places where the trade unions have formed political parties which have gone on to be important in the political life of a country, it's only in the UK, the Labour Party was a creature of the unions, and Brazil, more recently, under Lula, that trade unions have actually formed parties which came to power. In other contexts, parties have been formed which declare their commitment to advancing the interests of the working class or working people, which have drawn the support of workers and trade unions. I mean, it's a different kind of process. Why? Because trade unions represent the heterogeneity of society. It's entirely legitimate for some people join unions to advance their interests as workers. I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm an atheist, I'm an Ewe person, I'm an Ashanti person, I'm a Dagomba person, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm gay, I'm heterosexual. We are all in the trade union around the question of advancing our interests as workers. This heterogeneity means that when the trade union must really have strong legitimacy with the membership for it to form a party.
Yes.
Most of them would identify with it. Recently in South Africa, the NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA launched a party. It was a disaster. It split the party, the union, because they launched a socialist party and so. I don't think every member of NUMSA is a socialist. You know, it's okay for them to be conservative and to be anti-communist, because being a worker is not an ideological position, an economic and social status. So this is the point I will make. But what it points to also is that the realignment on the political landscape may not necessarily be in a way that will be beneficial to ordinary people, because political parties are about power. So they put out messages that get the vote. If I take the current context of Ghana, I take one issue, which is generating a lot of attention. The so-called family values and anti-gay law, where all the main religious organizations who are followed by millions of Ghanaians have lined up behind an incredibly repressive piece of legislation. The Methodist Church is planning a summit with the president to accelerate the passage of the law. Just recently, this thing about a girl being a 12-year-old being married in Mungwa, and the split which are shown in society. We can point to the possibility of conservative, repressive forces, for example, becoming a constituency to which some politician or politicians can appeal in the name of Ghanaian values. And they can come to power. So the factors that can drive a realignment are not simply the things that would advance people's material conditions. And in a climate where people are desperate, people want to give everything to their maker. Young people are gambling, spending a lot of money. Gambling has sprung up all over the place. In a climate of desperation, it's a moment also for what one political scientist called the emergence of charismatic, men of and women of destiny, offering what seem to be wonderful solutions, which respond usually to people's emotional needs because they promise something else. And so we are in that moment, really, where if you take that anti-LGBTQI law and the kind of the alliances that are built around it, if you take the alliances that are building up around traditional leadership in this country, expressed in various forms, whether it's the Nungwa Wulomo who marries a girl, or the claims of some chief somewhere to expel, non-natives, which the central government, both parties, keep quiet about. They tolerate these reactionary forces. So we have a block of consensus around something like this, which can drive the democratic agenda in a direction which can undermine the promise of the Constitution. So, because in that freedom of expression also, there's space for demagogues and people to seize on self-serving agenda. Because after all, we've seen examples where ordinary people are given millions of monies to so-called prophets. And these will turn out to be crooks who are molesting small girls in their churches. But they follow those leaders. And these are things that happen in moments of crisis. So, and if you look at, for example, the way someone like Mahama has felt the need to identify with this reactionary, repressive initiative from some members of his party. He may believe in it, but also think that's entirely opportunistic also, that he sees these other forces, the churches and so on, who he sees as aggregating voters, as a group. So what I'm pointing to is that the transformation of the political party landscape can take place with changes in how the parties position themselves, or can take place with the emergence of forces that challenge them. But that change is not necessarily going to take place in a direction which addresses the issues that you identified from the manifestos of the parties, or to address the agenda that Assets is putting out. Because identity politics of various sorts also is becoming a very visible part of the political culture in this country, partly because of the failure of leadership around issues that unite people and make them see that their material conditions are being improved.
So the idea of Vice President Mahamudu Bawumia and former President John Dramani Mahama making a truce and agreeing to have a summit to tackle the difficult questions and to take on the vested interests. Is it possible?
I think I would like to invite Dr. Graham to say something about this before I come in.
Ruby, this when I read this, I said this is a good sensational headline put out by two seasoned journalists, to tantalize the public. Let's take it at the level of as you imagined it. First of all, I don't think either of them will be interested in that, because they both desperately want to become president. And they both desperately want to become president, not because they want to transform this country for the benefit of the Ghanaian. Both of them are hostage to Bawumia in his case. I mean, he must be pinching himself to come from a complete outsider to become vice president. And then for an outgoing president, desperate basically to set up a protection racket to protect against the failures, the legacy of the failures and corruption of his regime, gets his party to select a vice president who historically had no base in the party, also at the risk of splitting the party, because that whole Alan phenomenon points to the effect of Bawumia. So Bawumia would love to be president. And those who are pushing for him have no interest in any summit. They want to cover up their years of mismanagement. He'll be a good agent for that project. If he does anything else for this country, it's a bonus. Mahama wants to come back to power because he thinks he has unfinished business. It is not clear to me what the content of that unfinished business is. Because when I listen, I haven't heard anything to give me great excitement about what he will represent. But the idea of a summit also, if they had a summit, what would be their definition of the problem that they are trying to solve? Both of them, in terms of what they have been party to historically, are not people who'd come up with solutions of the type that me and Yaban have been discussing. Take on the vested interest around the issues of the economy, the issues of the cultures of power, the issues of the institutions of this country and how they are misused. Neither of them are supported by a constellation of forces who are interested in resolving this thing. If they had a summit, it's likely to be to cut a rotten deal, which will not be particularly beneficial to the people of this country.
Now I can come in. Rosie, you know why I thought Dr. Graham should go first? Okay. No, I agree that on their own, they may not be contemplating that they want to hold a joint summit on the issues we've been discussing. They all know we have analyzed and overanalyzed the problems of this country, yet we are unable to get the policies to right them. One of the things that we seek to do under the asset initiative, the social contract initiative, is to bring them together, really. So I can tell you, if the civil society organizations come together and they have a strong voice and they invite these two guys, and I agree that they are all desperately looking for power. Yet, one of the reasons why it is possible to have such a summit is not that on their own they will organize it, but allow me to call them a third force of civil society organizations having very strong voice, including the trade unions, with this whole framework we call the social contract. And we invite them, and they know that they may, through the alliance or identifying with that process, get some votes. I think they will come. Now, when they do, and they commit to whatever is in the social contract, we, the civil society organizations, also have a reference document to challenge them when they are in power, to ensure that they have signed on to something, not their own political manifestos, but they have signed on to something that we all have agreed, whether they are MPP or NDC or they are independent candidates. And then we move along those lines. So that is where we are going. And we really want them to come together, because whether we like it or not, the polarization we have is one of the key issues we need to deal with. And bringing political party leaders together in that kind of manner is something that will move us towards that kind of unity that this country needs desperately.
But let me just add something here. I mean, in principle, of course, the idea of parties, some idea of national unity government and so on, it's a good idea. But I think the agenda around which any such unity is built is important. I mean, if you take the moment that we are in, deep economic crisis, indebtedness, an IMF program. Now, on those, and also the business of, say, a cocoa sector ridden with crises, if you look at the positions of the two parties on these fundamental issues, they are basically status quo parties. They are quite happy to accept an IMF package, when maybe the question should be asked about whether the terms of debt restructuring and austerity and so on that the IMF is offering are good for this country. Whether it is not time for there to be an African conversation about debt, the international economic relations as part of a medium-term approach to these questions. So when I say a rotten deal, it's a dramatic way of putting in terms of the fact that these two parties, apart from the fact that the controllers of the parties see power as an opportunity for the advancement of the interests of their own clique. Okay? But on the policy areas, Yaban said something earlier about what is the policy difference between these two parties. If they brought the policy consensus, which they've been united around for the past 30 years, to this summit and agreed to carry on like that, we are not going to get into the transformation agenda that this country needs.
No, I agree. Yes, but if, sorry, but if the social contract I've talked about has a different agenda from what has been happening in the last 32 years, then we think it's a good platform to get these political parties and all stakeholders around. And I can tell you that so far, we are not done yet with the document, but so far, we've gone quite far. And if indeed what we are developing, including the views we have, solicited from various groups within the civil society, we are likely to achieve some transformation. Of course, what we have seen in the last 30 years is not totally zero. I mean, Ghana will not be here if we haven't achieved anything. But the potential for Ghana to achieve more is there, which we are not, we are not getting there. And so all kinds of views are gathered. And we believe that the social contract will be a document for transformation. And if we get the political parties around it, first it will ensure unity. It will, to some extent, minimize the polarization, and we all will identify the path on which Ghana will be transformed. So we believe that this process will achieve something in the area of unity of the political parties, minimizing the polarization. And let me remind listeners that what we are doing under the Asset Initiative for Social Contract is not a 4-year thing or 8-year thing. We are targeting 25 years from next year. That brings the issue of planning and other things on board. So it's not just a medium-term thing. It's not a short-term thing. It's also a long-term thing.
I mean, so basically, I mean, in terms of getting some ideas and so on, I think it's great. The interesting thing would be whether the group behind this, involved in this asset process, what power they command for the ideas to take place. Because at the end of the day, it's the base in society what you command. As Stalin famously said about, during the Second World War, when the Vatican made some proposals about peace, Stalin asked, how many tank divisions does the Pope have?
But remember, the trade unions are supporting the asset initiative.
No, I'm not. Yeah, it is not. I'm not simply making. I'm not saying the initiative is not good. But the question of power, the reason why the parties are the way they are is because power serves them.
Yes.
So, and if they are not democratic organizations who are accountable to their rank and file in the choices that they make, if they were democratic organizations, what you are talking about has an even greater chance of success. Because we can say that. I mean, if you look at the NDPC plans done under various regimes, there's a huge overlap with the assets. I follow the assets. Though we are not involved.
They are part of it.
You take the Constitution, it's a wonderful framework, a vision for a country. And we are still where we are. So don't misunderstand me at all. We all are interested in the alternatives.
I'm interested to know when the social pact document will be ready. Will it be before the elections? I'm also, as we wind down, I'm also interested to know if the unions, which are a huge vested interest, when we talk about debt overhang, for example, 40% of government revenue goes to the budget for salaries. Is the union as a vested interest, which I'm made to understand none of the governments, when they come into power, want to touch that issue. Is that going to be part of the social contract in any way?
Yeah, I don't think I can discuss the specifics, but all the important things that will influence the development of this country are going to be covered. Of course, it includes employment and how we can achieve higher productivity. Now, that example you gave about 40% or more of government revenue going to workers. I want to emphasize that you were right to say it went to workers, because workers earn that money. And I can tell you, workers of this country are not earning what they deserve. They are not. That's why they are moving out. That is why our nurses and the midwives and the doctors are going away. If government is able to, give the right incentives for workers to stay, to help the development of this country, they will stay here. So it is an important, section in our social contract, how people can be made to work for their country, creating jobs and keeping them in their jobs in Ghana to the benefit of this country. People make a lot of, especially politicians, when they present this, they present it as if the 40% of revenue goes to workers as unemployment benefit. It is not like that. If you look at what government is paying for health, if you look at what government is paying for policing, if you look at what government is paying for social security and so on, it's not enough. I think that the conversation around that will really deal with this issue. Look, the social contract and how we have planned it will be such that we will launch it before the elections. If plans go as we all understand, we are likely to launch it in June. And then we will have various discussions with political parties, also jointly around that. And we are hoping that if we get all the forces in this country to identify with that kind of social contract, it will be a completely different initiative. It is not coming from the political parties. So it will be easier for political parties and other interests to align with us. And then we have Ghana as one interest. And that is what we seek to achieve. That everybody in this country should see Ghana rather than seeing political parties. And until we achieve that, it will be very difficult to achieve any transformational change.
Well, there's still a lot to discuss, but I think we've come to the end of our time. And I'm really grateful to you both, Dr. Anthony Yao Ba, Secretary General of the Ghana Trades Union Congress, and Dr. Yao Graham, Coordinator of Third World Network Africa. Thank you both very much for joining me today in this discussion.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I have with me my friend and co-host, Dede Amano Wilkes. She was listening quite intensely to that discussion. Dede, what did you think of what was said there? What was your feeling about it?
Very interesting. I think there was agreement between the two of them on many things, particularly on this idea of the disconnect between the major political parties and the electorate. The sense that things are at a really critical, that we're at a critical moment, possibly a turning point, but that if there's not a turning point, things could really fall apart. There's a crisis in our political system.
There is a crisis.
And then maybe a difference in the optimism with which they viewed the initiative to get civil society on board. I found that interesting, the different perspectives, because whereas I knew about the Asset Initiative, my fear was always that maybe a CSO initiative might lack bite. I didn't realize that the trade unions were part of it. And so to me, that's maybe the kind of bite that government might sit up and fear, because they have huge numbers behind them, the trade unions. But on the other hand, listening to Dr. Yal Graham, who's saying he's not part of the initiative, and his more sort of reserved view of what they can influence the two big parties to do, to change in the way government business, in the way our elections are run, it makes you wonder, yes, why do the trade unions being inside this civil society initiative have some confidence that this movement can actually arise from it, that can put pressure on the political parties to do things in a different way? And why would someone who's outside that development, that initiative, feel more reserved about the option? And he was making the point, Dr. Graham was making the point, that in countries where trade unions have been able to influence politics of parties, he mentioned the UK and Brazil specifically, they were very specific contexts. So yes, interesting. There's a lot to sort of fluff over. So, no, there's a lot to think about.
And so we got some big news about this social contract that they're going to launch in June. From my understanding, listening to the TUC General Secretary, Dr. Ba, it sounds like they're hoping that this will be a game changer to some extent, that it will create a new space that possibly would attract even the reluctant and self-serving political parties to maybe change track. That was the sense that I got from him. But from Dr. Graham, I got the sense that trade unions are made up of disparate people. The romantic idea that you can have a trade union lead a movement and change society is just that. It's just romanticism. Right. And the scary thing that he brought into the whole thing, this dark possibility of a coalition of very right-wing forces coming out of this LGBTQ movement that seems to be growing, coalition of forces of religious
and traditional
forces. And he was even suggesting that, politicians could take advantage of this climate of fear and to some extent hatred to form an alternative party to the two big ones, but that it would be to the right of these parties and way more authoritarian.
Yes, that there really is a crisis in that people have lost confidence in the political system, in the two big parties, and that there's a sort of vacuum, there's a power vacuum, because as Dr. Ba was saying, CSOs have opened the eyes and the minds of the electorate that, we cannot continue with this business as usual. They're now so disillusioned with the parties that people are potentially waiting for any force that will come and fill that vacuum. And one way of filling them, whereas on the one hand, the trade unions are thinking that they can fill it with something positive that will help the working people to improve their social and economic conditions, it could, on the contrary, be something quite, like you say, dark, or something quite negative, that because the churches and the religious bodies wield so much power now, they actually have a lot of influence over their congregations. And it could in fact be something different that doesn't necessarily help ordinary people, but takes us in a direction that would rather cause division in the society, less tolerance, a different society.
Well, let's see how it goes. I mean, everything is up in the air, but one thing we know is that the economy is under strain and people are suffering. So politics and economics go hand in hand, and to some extent, we all need some relief.
Although Dr. Graham said it's, the political parties are not interested in transformation, they're interested in their own agenda, the unfinished business or whatever. I suppose the greatest source of hope is that they may realize that there are certain fundamentals, certain principles, whether it's, equal rights for women, children's right to education and so forth, that they really can't afford not to sign up to. And that could be a start to have this agenda that NDPC, National Development Planning Commission, yes, the role that NDPC is actually supposed to fulfill, to have a common agenda that all political parties would buy into. Perhaps this social contract would be a start to achieving that.
But then it all depends on the amount of political force that this coalition can bring to bear on these parties, and that really depends on their unions.
That we can only hope that the trade unions will bring that bite, yes, to bring some action to the NGOC.
Thank you for that. That was great to chat. Thank you for joining us on Your Ghana, My Ghana, and subscribe to Graphic Online TV. See you next week.
For more news, please visit our website graphic.com.gh or follow us on Facebook at Daily Graphic and on YouTube and Twitter at GraphicGH.
Subscribe now.